Now I'd like to talk about some of the physical anomalies of UFOs, and here's what I mean by physical anomalies. First off, air friction. If you're in our space, at UFO speeds, air friction will happen. Air friction is when the surrounding air heats up around the object that's flying, and that air makes a sound. That's where you get things like sonic booms, when you go faster than the speed of sound. But this doesn't happen with UFOs, and it should, especially when they're flying at supersonic speeds near the ground. A sonic boom should be produced, but it's not. Occasionally we hear a whirring sound, but in general they're silent, and that is utterly impossible in our atmosphere because it's not related to the UFO, it's related to the air around the UFO. Even their engine should make some sort of sound. A second thing is air heating, and again, UFOs have been clocked at over 25,000 miles an hour in our atmosphere, and yet they don't burn up due to air heating up because of air resistance. Now you might say, well, they have a special metal. Okay, that's possible, but they should heat up somehow. A third thing is the UFOs, some of them change shape, size, and color in flight. Some of them break up into smaller craft, and then sometimes they recombine a bunch of smaller craft into one large craft. That just doesn't seem like something that's a physical entity. And I don't mean like an aircraft carrier where we launch planes off of that. I mean, these are flying and all of a sudden they break up or they recombine. Another physical anomaly is sometimes they'll appear and disappear instantaneously. In fact, as we've been videotaping them, sometimes they have appeared or disappeared in as little as 1/30th of a second, and that's the frame of some of the old videotapes. The camcorders are even less than that, and they're disappearing or appearing in one frame. Sometimes they will fade slowly away and they'll leave kind of a whitish cloud. And again, other times when they instantly disappear, sometimes they produce the sound of an explosion. Not a sonic boom, but just like an explosion. Another thing is they do remarkable acceleration and deceleration and directional changes at speeds that ought to tear their aircraft apart, to say nothing of the people inside the aircraft. One UFO was clocked at 16,000 miles an hour, and it made a right turn on a dime. Now, the law of momentum applies to anything in this physical universe, especially our planet. Anybody inside would have been splattered against the walls of the ship. You know how when you're turning a corner in a car, you and the car are going at the same speed. Well, when the car turns, what happens to you? Your body pushes up against it because your body's still going at the same speed in that direction. Well, that's fine if you're going 10, 15, 20 miles an hour. But 16,000 miles an hour, again, your body would splash up against the inside of the spacecraft. One UFO was clocked going from 280 kilometers per hour to 1,800 kilometers per hour while descending from 3,000 meters to 1,000 meters in 1 second. That represents an acceleration due to gravity of 40 Gs for anybody on the inside. Now, when humans are in special G suits, we can only take 8 Gs without blacking out. 40 Gs, again, our insides would be splattered on our body would be splattered on the insides of the spaceship. Another thing is sometimes UFOs show up on radar, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they show up on photographic film, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they show up on radar on every other pulse. How is that possible in our physical universe? Another thing is they've been observed going into the ground. Other times they've been observed going into the ground only to come out of the ground in a nearby place. Two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. How does that happen? While on the ground, they seem to be very heavy, yet in flight they behave as if they're massless due to these startling departures and sudden stops and right-angle turns. Some people almost have said, you know, it can't be a natural object to do that. It almost has to be supernatural. Another thing is, and this is a very valid thing, where are the UFOs hiding when they're not manifesting themselves? When they just disappear in 1/30th of a second, where do they go? Another thing is there's almost no constant design in UFOs. Now, our experience with machines says it's much simpler to design a prototype, copy its main parts, and then reproduce it. And then you only deviate for whatever purpose it's for. So all planes basically look alike. They only differ a little due to their purpose. Fighter jets are a little different than commercial airlines, and they're a little different than stealth bombers. But they pretty much all have two wings and a fuselage, and they've got jet engines coming out of them. So the idea that some superior civilization builds an infinite number of craft and then sends them to Earth only once, that just sounds unacceptable. I mean, it's not a proof of anything, but it just doesn't make sense. John Keel has said that the statistical data indicates that UFOs are not stable machines requiring fuel, maintenance, or logistical support. They are, in all probability, transmogrifications of energy that do not exist in the same way that this book exists. They are not permanent constructs of matter. Whoa. Now you may be thinking, okay, well, what are they? Well, we'll get to that. Physicist Jacques Lamarck said, quote, "We can consequently conclude that it is impossible to interpret the UFOs in terms of material spaceships as we normally think of them." Okay, now I'd like to kind of summarize all of this and give you some physical arguments against what is known as the nuts and bolts view of UFOs, and by that I mean that they're extraterrestrials from another planet. Some of these things we've talked about, some of these things we will talk about in a few minutes, but I'm going to kind of combine them together. The first thing is, and again, none of these stand on their own, but when you take all of them into consideration, it's like, yeah, this isn't making a lot of sense. The first thing is the variety of craft, which we just talked about. There's just way too much variety. It also changes as our technology changes. First it was shields and balls of fire, then it was blimps basically, and then it was flying machines, and now it's flying saucers, that sort of thing. So there's just way too much variety here. And a second thing is the extreme acceleration and deceleration of some of these ships. You can't do that in our atmosphere and have anybody inside still live. A third thing is the near right-angle turns they make at the high speeds. The momentum would splatter anybody on the inside. A fourth thing is when they go faster than the speed of sound, there's no sonic booms, and there has to be. A fifth thing is there's an absence of air friction effects. We don't see the air is heating up around these things, or these UFOs, when they should be. A sixth thing is the appearance and the disappearance of the craft. I mean, it's not like in Star Trek where, you know, the ship comes flying in. It's like these things appear and disappear like that. Another thing is Sometimes they have luminous tails to them that suggest rocket power. Sometimes they have lingering wisp to them. And sometimes there's nothing on there. An eighth thing is, and we'll also talk about this in a few minutes, there's a decrease in temperature around these craft, and they're not hot. They're very, very cold. That makes no sense at all, flying at those speeds. A ninth thing is the pungent odors associated with this. And anytime somebody sees a UFO close up, they almost always say, wow, did it stink? I mean, the odor was, it's a terrible odor. Sometimes when UFOs have landed on the ground or come close to landing, there's been a burnt earth. They burn the trees or the grass around there. An 11th thing is there's usually some sort of electrical interference when a UFO comes close to, like, a car or a home or something like that. A 12th thing is these crafts can just split up. One craft can split up into 4, 5, or 6 different crafts, and then they can combine together. They can rejoin into one craft. Another thing is, a 13th thing is, they change shape in flight. Now that's something that a mechanical ship just couldn't do. And some of these changes are dramatic. A 14th thing is, we've seen them fly into the ground and come out of the ground. And again, how does a physical UFO go into the ground or come out? Two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. A 15th thing is sometimes they're detected on film and not by sight. A 16th thing is sometimes they're detected by sight and not on film. A 17th thing is sometimes they're detected on radar, sometimes they're not, and sometimes it's on every other pulse, which is really strange. An 18th thing is, and this is just kind of strange, how the UFOs have progressed to be just a little bit ahead of the technology of the people observing them. That's a little weird. A 19th thing is their strange religious message, and we'll get into that. Another thing is their cat and mouse method of revealing themselves makes no sense at all. Why don't they just come right, if they've observed us, why don't they come right down on the White House lawn? Or why don't they send us a radio message that would be broadcast on all of our satellites in orbit that says, hey, we're from another world, we want to contact you, we want to give you the cure for cancer to let you know that we're good people, and please tell us how we can then come down to your planet. They don't do that. What do? They appear to 2 drunks in Pascagoula, Mississippi, who were on a fishing trip, who have just finished 24 cans of beer in Pascagoula, Mississippi in 1971. I'm not saying anything about drunks there, but they're just not appearing to the people we think they would appear to. A 21st thing is their strange abduction cases and their preoccupation with sex. When they take these humans aboard their craft, almost all of them report that they were probed and prodded, and with special attention to the genitalia area. That's really strange. A 22nd thing, and we'll talk about that when we talk about alien abductions. A 22nd thing is, early in the 1950s, when we started hearing from these aliens through the contactees, they made outright lies about things that we later found out about. They said Saturn existed with a subtropical atmosphere. Venus had a lot of forest and rivers flowing through it. I mean, those were just lies. We knew about some of that at the time, but we found out about a lot of that later in the 60s when we sent satellites there. And the last thing is the number of planets and stars that they say they're from is way too distant. And I'll give you an example. In the Pleiades constellation, when we look up at that, we say, yeah, it's a constellation. But those stars are actually farther apart than they are from us to the nearest one. And yet some of these aliens are saying, well, we're from the Pleiades. Really? That just doesn't make sense.